I want to welcome everyone to tonight's Culinary Medicine. I'm hoping that everyone can. I am so happy to see all these beautiful faces, and I hope you had a good day today. We have a very talented group of people, and I welcome new and old friends that are on the call. So tonight we are doing spring seeds, soil, testing, planting, and we have a very great expert who lives right here in Clintonville, which I have to exclaim, it's a wonderful place to grow. But Dr. Tall is internal medicine at Ohio State, involved with a lot of education, took medicine in a more holistic approach, became very involved in gardening, took the extension course and worked with the extension agents at Ohio State, which they also, I would suggest, run a master gardening program, which hopefully will start back up as COVID diminishes. There are wonderful, wonderful resources that he will talk about. And so he will basically get you started this spring. And then at the end of his time, Rosemary is going to make a delightful spring salad. So I am going to turn the program over to Dr. Tall. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And Laura, thank you for inviting me. This is a topic I really enjoy. So having the opportunity to speak to a group is always a real pleasure. I feel like I'm passing it forward. Things that I learned from Mike Hogan at the Extension Office. I love the opportunity to pass it on to other people, this great hobby of gardening. So let me share my slides here. If you give me just one moment. Can you all see the slides there? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Okay, very good. So the topic, health professionals can make great gardeners. And the reason I say that is on my reflection over the last couple of years, I've come to realize a lot of the things that we learn as healthcare professionals actually lend themselves quite well to the skills needed to successfully grow healthy plants and vegetables. So just a little background so you know who you're talking to. I've been in Columbus now for 23 years. I did my training at Ohio State and joined our division of general internal medicine back in 2000. And my outpatient practice is there at the Morehouse Clinic on Kenny Road. So ironically, it's right across the street from the labs and the farming labs at OSU, Waterman Farms. So that's my background. I actually not only provide clinical services, but I've done a lot of administrative work, and I served as division director for our division for about 8 years until about 1.5 years ago, and had the opportunity to manage about 60 physicians in their 7 practices around the city of Columbus. And I partly share this with you just so you know my medical background, but more so understand that a lot of the things that I learned as a clinician, but also as an administrator, have helped me run a community garden successfully. It does take a lot of organizational skills and management skills, and fortunately, they've lent themselves quite well to this hobby of mine. So I'm going to describe a little journey for you. We bought our property about 4 years ago in Clintonville. And as you can see, it was just all sod, lots of sunlight. And it was at the same time that I was taking the Master Gardener class that Mike Hogan offers through the Extension Office. And it was literally halfway through the class that this opportunity came up to buy the property. And I can still remember excusing myself for class to sort of seal the deal and then walk back in, and Mike Hogan was standing there and he's like, "What's going on?" I said, "Well, I just bought a farm." Not that I bought a farm, but I basically bought some beautiful land that I could grow a really nice garden in. So it was pretty thrilling. And the picture there has my kids in the background that helped me try to convert this huge patch of sod over to a viable garden. So that's where we started. And this is what it looks like as of last year. So it's been quite the transformation of taking just a big flat piece of land with a lot of grass and turning it into this lush garden that provides food for our 5 families that co-manage this community garden with us. So a lot of what I share with you is what I've learned over the last 3 to 4 years in applying what Mike Hogan started for me. We grow a tremendous variety of plants. It's upwards of 85 to 90 different vegetables and flowers and herbs. So each plant has its own personality and its own growth growing requirements, and it's been fun learning the idiosyncrasies of each plant, trying to get them to succeed. Liz mentioned the extension office, and Mike Hogan's the extension officer that teaches this master urban farming workshop, and they offer them in the fall. And you can see they start in September. And if they do get this back up and running this year, I would highly recommend, if you have time, to take these classes. They're at 6:30 in the evening. They go for 3 hours, and you just learn a ton of really useful information. And what I learned taking the classes, a lot of things that I thought led to successful gardening were not. It's not an intuitive process. There are a lot of new things to learn. One of the books they'll introduce you to when you take this class is a book called The Market Gardener. It's by Jean-Martin Fortier, and he's a market gardener that works up in Maine. And a lot of what my garden is based on is what he writes about in this book, which is basically a French gardening technique. It's basically intensive farming, intensive gardening in a small plot with 30-inch beds, pretty standardized measures. But the key there is it's high intensity gardening, so you get a lot of produce out of a small area. The other character that I tend to follow is a gentleman named Charles Dowding, and he really promotes no-dig organic gardening. So it's no-till, he doesn't turn the soil up, which, you get pretty much the same amount of production, or maybe a little bit more even with this approach. But what's most important, it really decreases the workload, and it's a less backbreaking to do his form of gardening, which I really like because I'm getting up in the years and my joints and my back are starting to hurt. So I would highly recommend you check out Charles Dowding on YouTube. The other resources I've used over the years is the OSU Extension Office. Obviously, they have lots of literature about growing successfully in the climate that we live in here in Ohio. So they have tons of resources. And one of the gentlemen I'd highly recommend you try to follow if you want to really grow in your gardening skills is Tim McDermott, who's the extension officer for Franklin County, and he's specifically in charge of promoting knowledge around home gardens. So he has monthly updates on growing Franklin, and I always watch those. They're basically 1-hour videos, and he keeps you up to date on the season and what you should be planting, depending on what time of the year it is. So he's a wonderful resource. The other resource that I'd share with you is Johnny's Seeds, which, in the past, I used to buy my transplants or seeds at a local nursery. And what I've learned over the years is that if you go to some of these higher quality online distributors, the quality of the seeds that you get and the variety of the seeds you get just far surpasses what you can buy at the nursery. So they're a little bit more expensive. You might pay $3 or $4 for a small packet of seeds, and the packet will only have sometimes 25 seeds in them. But when you actually plant those, they're far more likely to sprout, and the disease resistance, the vigor of the plants that they sell is just it really just doesn't compare to what you can get at your local nursery. So Johnny Seeds is a wonderful resource, not only for seed purchases, but also they have a lot of literature. They have a whole library of information that helps you grow your plants. So I just want to start with some resources that I thought you could benefit from. Now, let's jump right in and talk about the keys to our success here in Clintonville. We're going to talk about location. We're going to talk about soil fertility, water management. We'll talk about some of the fabrics that you can use that really decreases some of the challenges with weeds and insect pressure. We'll talk a little bit about plant spacing and how important that is to success. We'll discuss a little bit about the importance of scouting. And then lastly, some tips on growing your own seedlings, which is really relevant to today because this is around the time that people start a lot of their seedlings for their summer plans. So location. When you first start your garden, you really want to think hard about where you're going to place it. As much light as possible is critical. A lot of the plants that you're going to grow, whether they be herbs or for vegetables, they really need a lot of light and direct sunlight. It's a little deceptive in the winter because the sun's lower and you might get shadows from trees in locations that may not be the situation during the summertime. But think really hard and try to compromise on some things to make sure you get into the sunniest location in your garden that you can. We fortunately, as you can see, have almost 12 plus hours of sunlight every day in our garden. I'm going to focus on this soil health issue because it really is critical to success. And let me just go through these one at a time. So number one, Ohio has a lot of clay soil, and I always grew up hearing my parents say how bad the soil was where we grew up. It was all soil and you just could never grow anything. Well, that's a bit of a misnomer. Clay soil is not inherently bad soil to grow in. In fact, clay has certain chemical properties that allows it to hold on to nutrients. So, we talk about adding fertilizers. A lot of times if you have sandy soil, other kinds of soil, a lot of those nutrients will wash out when you have a heavy rain. But clay soil has the benefit because of its electrical charges to hold on to a lot of the nutrients that we put into the soil. So in itself, it's not bad, but what it really needs is a lot of supplementation with organic matter. And we'll talk about that in a moment. The other key point on improving soil health that I've learned is to not disturb the soil. I always thought of, the spring hearing rototillers going, and what I've learned over the years is that is not good for the soil. It really breaks down the structure, and we'll talk about that. You want to prevent compaction, meaning don't walk on your soil, especially when it's wet. If it's wet and you walk on it, you crush it and you basically remove all the air pockets that are down in the soil that the roots really benefit from. So our policy, if I see my kids out in the garden, is you cannot walk on where the plants grow or will grow. Keep the soil covered because when it's exposed, believe it or not, when you have a heavy downpour, per square inch of, a raindrop hitting the soil seems like a trivial matter, but it's actually a high impact injury to the soil. And it's a lot like walking on the soil. So I try to keep my soil covered when I'm not planting into it. We'll talk about soil testing. And then lastly, we'll really highlight the importance of adding organic materials to your soil and all the benefits that come with it. So let's talk about for a moment what soil structure you're trying to promote. If you look at what happens over time when there's a lot of animal life, meaning bacteria, fungi, worms, and creatures like that in your soil, and even the roots from the plants that you grow, if you leave the roots down in the ground once you've harvested a plant, if you put compost in, which is food for a lot of the a lot of the insect life and invertebrate life, what they do is they secrete proteins that are sticky, and it causes all these little soil particles to start to stick together, and they form these things called aggregates. And in this slide, what you're seeing here is an aggregate, lots of little aggregates. Why that's important is because it creates air pockets, varying size of air pockets, from large air pockets, it says large pores, to small air pockets. The large air pockets hold air and the small pockets hold water. And what you want for optimal plant growth is about a 50-50 mix of air and water in your soil. And the key to getting that to happen is by not disturbing it and feeding the organisms and allowing these aggregates to form. Here's another little picture of what these aggregates look like. You don't think about those in the soil, but that's what's happening year after year if it's undisturbed and there's a lot of animal life and plant life and fungal life in that soil. They'll form these aggregates and form a nice sort of tilth that'll hold water and air to supply the roots of your plants with an optimal environment. When you rototill, you destroy these aggregates. Here's just another illustration of the importance of these varying sizes of particles, these aggregates, and how it promotes holding water and how it promotes holding air in the soil. And what I've seen is a transformation from a pure clay soil over to this really rich soil that's really fluffy almost. If you put your hand on it, it's almost fluffy, and you can imagine the roots just growing straight through. But it's taken about 2 to 3 years to get there. This slide just highlights the point I made earlier, which is don't rototill your garden. Now, if you work in a community garden, sometimes they rototill it for you, so you don't have a choice. But if you're doing it in your yard and you do have a choice, try not to do that. It's better to use a spade or a broad fork. And what I do is I just put it down into the soil and then I just rock it back and forth a little bit, just to kind of loosen that soil up, create some air pockets for water and roots and nutrients to get down into the deeper layers. But that'll not only save your back and your joints, but it'll also be a much better improvement for the soil. What I use is a broad fork because I've got a big garden, but I would recommend if you have a small garden just to buy a spade. And what a broad fork is just 5 or 6 tines. They're pretty long, maybe 8 or 10 inches long, and you just plunge it straight down. You use your body weight to push it down into the soil, and then you just rock it back and forth about 6 to 10 inches, and then pull it up and move about 6 more inches, plunge it down into the soil, rock it back and forth. All you're doing is creating some air pockets, but you're not flipping the soil over. You're not disturbing it. You're not bringing weed seeds up to the surface. You're just creating some openings in the soil. And here's a picture from our garden with one of our teammates here using a broad fork, and he's working his way down that row every 6 inches, pushing that broad fork in and rocking it back and forth. Covering your soil when you're not planting, again, very important. You could keep it real simple and just put a tarp over your soil. I will commonly do this in the wintertime. And when I don't have plants in there, it not only warms the soil, protects it from rain, and obviously prevents animals from digging and weed seeds for settling in. So that's a really nice, simple way when you're not planting to have your soil covered. Another way to keep your soil covered is with cover crops. So this is buckwheat that somebody's placed into a raised bed. These germinate really quickly in the summertime and create they not only cool the soil, but they also add organic material. What you don't do is mow this down and toss it away. You basically cut it down and let it lay on the soil itself, and it'll start to break down and get incorporated into the soil. One of the other things that I've spent a lot of time learning about is nutrients. In Ohio, the soils are really pretty rich in all these micronutrients on the right side. So I don't really worry about those. Plus, when I add compost, the compost has a lot of these micronutrients. The carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, obviously that's just coming from the air and the water that we provide the plants. But the key macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and a little bit less, to a lesser amount, is calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. But those are the macronutrients that are critical. And what I've learned over the years is when you have a successful garden, you're harvesting a lot of this out and you're eating it. So you're pulling all these nutrients out of the soil. You're going to have to put it back in somehow, whether it's just through compost or through synthetic fertilizers. And I use a mix of the two in my garden. The way I determine how much fertilizer to apply is by soil testing. And if you learn anything today, I'll try to make some key points, but soil testing is just this really great way to have a very informed calculation of how much fertilizer needs to be applied to your garden. And I use Penn State for my soil testing. They only charge like $7 or $8 to do it. And you can use a little soil plug device like this. It's almost like taking a biopsy of your soil. You basically move away maybe the top 1 inch and then plunge this down in and pull that little biopsy device up and pull that soil out. If you go to the website, they'll tell you how to soil test. You could just use a shovel, honestly, just use a trowel, just move away the surface debris and then dig down about 8 inches and pull up some soil. And I just sample different places in the garden, mix it all together, dry it out, put it in a bag with an invoice and send it off to Penn State. And usually about 2 or 3 weeks later, I get my test results back. This is the form that you can download from Penn State's website. And you'll want to pick what kind of vegetables or what kind of plants you plan to grow, because the instructions they'll give you will be dependent on what you list as your goal. So I usually pick mixed vegetables on my soil test invoice. And a couple of weeks later, I get a test like this, and it tells me not only my soil pH, whether it's optimal or not, it tells me where I stand as far as phosphate, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. But what's most important is they give me very specific instructions on how much fertilizer to add. You don't want to just do this blindly. You can end up creating, almost a toxic state in your soil if you're not careful with fertilizers. So in this example, right down here, it says apply 3.5 pounds per 100 square feet of 5-10-5 and 0.5 pounds per 100 square feet of a high phosphorus fertilizer. So just very specific instructions on how to get your soil fertility back up for the season. I usually do this in the early spring so that my soil is up to a certain fertility level for the year. I won't go through all the details here. If there's questions at the end, maybe I can talk about some of these other elements. pH is obviously really critical. Vegetables like to grow between 6.6 and 7 on the pH scale. So these soil test results usually give you instructions on how much lime to add or how much acid to add to your soil if need be. So soil testing, leave yourself a little note. It's super fun. You get a result back, and it's a lot like being a doctor. We're accustomed to replacing electrolytes. Well, you're basically just replacing electrolytes in the soil, and you're well equipped to understand and respect the importance of doing that correctly. The other thing about soil fertility is adding compost or organic matter. You can use cover crops and things like that. I tend to just buy bagged manure. I don't use my own compost for my garden just because I don't want to reintroduce a lot of weeds into the vegetable garden. And the stuff that you buy at the nursery is usually sterilized, and it's just easier. So that's the route I've taken. It's hard to compost enough. You know, you can pile stuff up all year long and you end up with about 1 bucket of compost at the end of the year, which isn't usually enough to really make a difference. You want to really go heavy. And I'll put 1 to 2 inches of compost over the entire garden every year. On the topic of cover cropping, here's an example. This was a patch on the left of where we had squash planted, and we harvested out the squash. We pulled the vines out, and then we planted buckwheat into it, and the buckwheat sprouted, and you get a nice dense patch of buckwheat cooling the soil. And what's really wonderful about buckwheat is it flowers and it brings in literally millions of bees, both native and honeybees, into your garden. So it's quite a sight to see a huge patch of buckwheat and literally millions of bees flying around. I'm going to turn my attention and talk about water management for a moment. I use drip lines, and I'll tell you the reason is it's a little high maintenance, but when you spray your plants from above with a garden hose or a sprinkler, what you're doing is, one, you tend to knock the plants down. Number two, when that water is hitting the soil, it's a lot like rain, it's compacting the soil. Number three, you don't really know how much water you're adding, which is always, I think a bit of a problem. You can underwater pretty easily with a garden hose. It's also wasteful because a lot of the water evaporates off the plants and doesn't actually get into the soil. But lastly, it actually promotes a lot of disease because if those plants stay wet into the evening, you're more likely to get viral diseases and particularly fungal diseases on your plants, which is really hard to manage once they get established. I use a rain gauge, and I just have a rain gauge out in the garden, and I know that I want about 1 inch of rain per week. And during the hot times of the year when it's like 90 plus, I want 2 inches of rain per week. And all I do is I back calculate. So if we got a ½ inch of rain the week, then I'll just calculate how long I need to run these drip lines to add another ½ inch of rain or ½ inch of water to my garden. So rain gauges are great. There are a lot of fun little tools that you can buy on the market these days that make life easier. I have this little device hooked up to my garden hose or to the irrigation system we have set, and I control it with my iPhone. So I can be at work and I know the weather forecast is that it's going to be really hot, and I'll just program in and say, turn the water on and run it for 2 hours. And I know my plants will be healthy when I get home and not wilted by the end of the day. Here's just a little setup I have. So I do use, like I said, drip lines and drip tape, which you can buy online. I just have these little valves so I can open and close the drip lines. I do use landscape fabric when I can. Again, I'm trying to be practical. I'm growing a lot of stuff and I can't really deal with weeds all summer long. And I imagine you've had the experience where, one day there's some tiny little weeds there and you literally come back in a week and the entire garden's been taken over by weeds. Well, by using landscape fabric and cutting holes in it, the plants have the best opportunity to outcompete the weeds that they're obviously always there and waiting to just take over. I do use row covers, and Liz and I were talking about this a little while ago. Row covers are just absolutely fabulous. Of all the things that has made a difference in my garden, it was soil testing, improving that soil health, and then these row covers. I think those are the two biggest things that made a difference. And I never used these in the past until I took that class. They come in all different grades. They can be low grades, which are just really trying to keep the insects out. They can come in medium grades, which will actually create a little warm microclimate underneath. But they're good in a lot of ways. Again, not only preventing insect damage, but it protects it from the wind, protects it from harsh rains. It warms the environment underneath, and the plants really seem to thrive under these row covers. I also use shade cloth. So in the heat of the middle of summer, people think peppers and tomatoes love the heat. They don't. In fact, if the temperature gets well over 80 degrees, closer to 90, a lot of times they'll drop all their flowers. So I'll put shade cloths on my peppers, eggplants, tomatoes in the middle of summer to try to give them a little bit of a break from that intense heat. You can read about this, but there's different grades of row fabric. If you look at the numbers, maybe you want to use this as a reference, but 15 is mostly just insect protection. It doesn't increase the heat, which is great in the middle of summer. You don't want to overheat your plants. 19, sort of the middle, creates a warmer microclimate in the spring and the fall. And that's what I have out right now. And then grade 30 blocks 30% of the light from getting in. And it's mostly frost protection in the coldest times of the year. So like I just overwintered spinach under this 30 grade fabric, and it looks fabulous. And we've already had about 4 harvests of spinach this month. And then the shade cloth, like I mentioned, it cools the plants down. I'm going to keep moving along for quick here. What I mentioned earlier is that this French gardening technique, it's an intensive gardening technique, farming technique. And what they do is they have standards. They plant 30-inch rows. And it's important because a lot of the stuff you buy online is based on this. So the row fabric, the landscape covers, it's all based on 30-inch rows. And then I have an 18-inch walkway on each side for me to be able to get into the garden itself. But what's really important is to learn how much to space your plants out. And in this example, they have carrots, and they've put 5 rows on a 30-inch bed. And what that does is, as that plant matures, when it's about 3/4 the way to complete maturity, it will form a canopy over the soil, which will block out light and it'll keep weeds from growing. So it's tight enough to form a canopy, but it's spaced out enough that the roots don't compete with each other. So what a lot of market gardeners and farmers have done over the years, have done lots and lots of experiments to try to figure out what's the ideal spacing to balance that, how to form a canopy quickly so you don't have weed pressure and a lot of water evaporation, but also not so close that the roots compete and the plants don't thrive. And here's pictures from my garden. These are radishes. So I plant 5 rows in a 30-inch bed. And here's a week later, and here's a week later. So you can see within 2 weeks, it's formed a perfect canopy over the soil, and I don't have a lot of weed pressure competing with my plants. So that's worked for me year after year. And the books that I provided you as references have a lot of details on what the proper plant spacing is if you use one of these 30-inch wide beds as a standard in your garden. Here's some other slides from those books. We have 2 last bullet points here, and then what I'll do is I'll just share some slides, some photographs from my garden just to kind of inspire folks. I said earlier that healthcare professionals can make good gardeners, and I think it's one of the reasons because we're trained to make observations and diagnose conditions. Well, I go out and scout my garden every day, get down on my hands and knees and look real carefully, and you'll see different kinds of insect damage. You'll look at different kinds of viral or fungal damage. If you can catch it early, you can jump on it and either pull that plant out or use other mechanisms to get rid of these pests that will take over if you don't get on them early. These are the previous picture, squash bugs. These are potato beetles that get on eggplants and potatoes, obviously. This is a vine borer. Have you ever had a spinach plant that looked really robust and you're getting lots of spinach and then literally overnight it wilted? Well, this little moth, this daytime moth, lands and plants 1 egg. It lays 1 egg on the stem right at the base of the plant. And this one little larva grows and it eats out the vasculature of the plant, and the plant just wilts literally overnight. So it's 1 insect that destroys your entire zucchini plant. So again, scout and try to find early signs of damage so you can address it. The last thing I'd share with you is the importance of learning to grow your own plants. You can certainly go to the nursery and get plants, and I think that's completely fine if you have a small garden. But as I mentioned earlier, the variety of plants, the disease resistance, the vitality of the plants that you buy from places like Johnny Seeds and Harris Seeds are unmatched. So I've spent a lot of time over the years learning how to plant and grow healthy seedlings. And these are some of the bullet points. And I won't go over each piece of it for the sake of time, but there is an art to it. But it's very doable, and you'll catch on fairly quickly if you try to do this in your own home. And I grow them in the basement under grow lights, and then I move them out into the garden. So here's my little setup. Obviously, I have a pretty large garden. So this is a 4x4 flood table with some shop lights on it. I just used, regular fluorescent bulbs, and then the plants grow under there. And when they're about 4 weeks of age, maybe 6 weeks of age, I bring them outside and harden them off. And we can talk about that if there's time. This is a little hardening table I set up on the side of the house. It's just what my daughter calls it our bunk bed, our plant bunk bed. But I put a shade cloth over them because when they first go out, they're pretty vulnerable. They'll bleach in this bright sunlight. So I put a pretty heavy shade cloth over them to keep them protected. And over, maybe 4, 5, 6 days, they'll form a waxy layer on their leaves and not dry out and bleach when you finally get them out in the garden. So you don't want to spend a whole lot of time growing seedlings and then have them die promptly within 30 minutes of putting them out in the garden. So get them hardened off well before you plant them out into the garden. Some of the other resources on this slide are just planting schedules. It's really important to follow these planting schedules. Johnny Seeds has a planting schedule. You just plug in your last frost date. I put May 10th, and it'll tell you when you want to start your seedlings, when you want to plant them out. So I follow this pretty religiously because you can get burned pretty easily with a freeze. So those are the highlights of what I wanted to share. Really, the point was those are the key things that I learned. They were not intuitive. I learned them through the class by reading these books and learning from Tim McDermott. So it's pick a good location, work really hard year over year, improving soil fertility, learn how to manage water, ideally through drip lines and things like that. Really consider using landscape fabric and row covers. They can make a huge difference in the things that people really get aggravated over, which is, squirrels digging things up, insects eating up your plants. Think about plant spacing and use a reference. Don't just get out in the garden and get over enthusiastic and plant your plants too close together. Get out there and scout really frequently, once a day. It's fun. It kind of creates a certain intimacy with your plants in your garden. And then give it a shot at growing your own seedlings. I'm going to take the last 2 minutes here, and I am just going to, well, not 2 minutes, but I'll take the last 5 minutes and just show you a bunch of slides from our garden, hopefully maybe to inspire you. This is a garden. This is a tomato row. There's 60 tomatoes growing on these vines. I sucker them, so it's just one vine that grows straight up, and then I drag them across that wire. So my tomato vines will grow 15 feet long on that line, and I'll get 12 clusters of tomatoes on each plant. So we grow a lot of tomatoes. Here's a beautiful brandywine tomato. Here's what it looks like when you slice into it. You don't need to do anything with that. You just eat it. Use a little pinch of salt. Don't do anything more with it. We can a lot. So we take our plum tomatoes and we just finished our last can last night of our tomato sauce. Here's some beautiful cabbages growing out in the garden, nice and dense. Some broccoli and some kale. We grow watermelons, surprisingly, pretty successful. Here's some beauties coming in the house. This is my daughter. One of the reasons I really enjoy gardening is I get to watch my kids eat really healthy food, and they have a greater appreciation for where food comes from and how much work it takes to make a healthy meal. Here's some beets, and we grow lots of garlic. I grow about 100 heads of garlic each year. I think we're having a quick lesson on a meal using peas. Those should be in the garden pretty soon if you haven't. We have rats in Clintonville, so I can't put seeds in the ground. The rats will dig them right up. So I actually start my peas as transplants. So I start them as seedlings. I put, if I get a large little module, I put about 3 seeds deep down in there and let them grow for about 2 weeks. And once they're about maybe 5 or 6 inches tall, I plant them deep into the soil and they do fabulous and it gets them a head start. So my peas, like a lot of people plant their peas on St. Patrick's Day, I put my transplants in on St. Patrick's Day. So my pea plants are already about, a foot tall, and they're just under row cover to keep them protected. We grow a lot of brambles. So I've got a 40-foot row of raspberries and blackberries, and it's a real joy watching my kids enjoy plateful after plateful of beautiful, sweet raspberries. Sometimes you find little treasures out in the garden. And the other thing that's been wonderful for me is just working with a community of people. We've got 5 families and we co-manage this garden, and we get together every Saturday morning. And through the pandemic, we've still gotten together every single week on Saturday morning for 2.5 to 3 hours. And what I'm impressed by is how much a team of people can get done in a garden in a 2-hour window. It's just really incredible how that army comes in and clears out the weeds and gets everything planted and cleaned up for the week. And then we do it again every weekend. So it's been a wonderful opportunity. We've had lots of time to play with our kids in the garden, and hopefully they're growing and gaining some skills that they'll have in the future. This is my wife, who's put up with me over the years, transitioning over to this new hobby. And I'm going to stop there. And maybe looks like we may have 5 or 10 minutes for any questions or thoughts that people want to share.
That was wonderful. And so yes, please, questions.
How do you keep the critters out?
When you say critters, I assume you mean
The little animals that eat all of my plants.
squirrels,
Like rabbits and squirrels. Yeah.
Yeah, they're a real problem, aren't they? It's really hard to manage. I tend not to have that much of a problem, partly because the garden is so big that, maybe 10% gets eaten by something. And it doesn't bother me because I'm almost overplanting. I think the row covers keep a lot of the creatures out. When I put that row cover on there, I weigh it down. I fill bags of gravel, and I weight that row fabric down really tight. Not only because it keeps the wind from blowing everything away, but it also, I think, has a big effect on keeping some of the animals out. But, squirrels are tough, chipmunks are tough. Sometimes they just want to really get in there. It's hard. A lot of the neighborhoods have so many animals in them. And for whatever reason, I live in Clintonville, there's lots of animal life, but I haven't had too many problems really at all. Someday I'm going to get a groundhog in here. I'm probably going to be in therapy after that.
Neeraj, do you have any recommendations for, we live in a neighborhood where we can't farm in the ground, but more pots? Any recommendations on how to do maybe a smaller version of what you're doing?
Yeah, I can give you a couple of tips. So you can't do a raised bed either? Okay, so growing in containers can be really satisfying. There's a couple of things that I'd give you tips on. Number one is you need to get really large containers. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, they require 5-gallon, 10-gallon containers. The problem with that is it's sort of price limiting, right? To try to buy a pot that's that large can be, $30, $40, $50 per pot. But you can buy grow bags now for a really low price. So if you go to Johnny's Seeds, they'll sell grow bags. They're made of plastic, the same fabric that makes that landscaping fabric, but it's really heavy duty. It's actually really good. You can grow really healthy plants in large grow bags. You just line them up. You can use drip lines to run the water into them because they dry out pretty quickly. But there's a lot of aeration, right? Because the whole sides, there's oxygen that can flow into the soil. And what's particularly nice about fabric bags is when the roots hit the edges, they don't start wrapping around. If you have a pot, you get something called a root bound plant because they hit the plastic and then they turn and they grow around in circles. If it's fabric, they'll hit the edge and they'll almost self-prune themselves. They'll stop growing and they'll branch farther up the root system. So you actually get a much more rich network of roots when you grow in these grow bags. If you put them on your driveway, they heat up early in the spring, so you can get plants in really early in the spring. The problem, though, is in the summer when it's really hot, they can cook and overheat. So you want to create some protection, but keep them watered as much as you possibly can. So I don't use grow bags, but Tim McDermott talks about it in some of his conversations, and they're a fabulous way to grow either on your patio or in your driveway.
Thank you. Thanks.
So we do have a question in the chat Lisa wants to know, do you stage plant so you don't have everything mature at once?
Yeah, so what's the word we use for that? I'm forgetting the word that the gardeners use for
I
that.
use successive planting.
Successions, yeah, okay, successions. A good example is radishes. So it depends on the plant, but if you look at that Market Gardener book, it'll actually give you some instructions. Elliot Coleman has some really good information on succession planting, meaning how far apart to plant each succession and when you should start them. So for instance, lettuce is a good example. You don't want all your lettuce to mature at the same time, but you may want to plant you have to figure out how many, but every week start another batch. What I do that with radishes. So I start another, 20 modules of radishes every week because I know I'll be pulling that amount out every week. So it takes a little bit of forethought and a little planning, but succession planting is really important, especially for things like lettuces, root crops, things like that, where you don't really want to get too much all at once. I don't do succession plantings with summer plants like tomatoes and eggplants and peppers. They just need the whole summer anyway, so I don't do any successions there. I do successions with okra because okra tends not to make it all the way through the year. It tends to get fungal and diseases and things like that. So I'll replant successions, particularly since if one plant goes bad, I can pull it out and put in a new transplant. So that's another way I use succession planting.
So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Rosemary. If you have more questions, you can definitely be in contact with Dr. Tall. And so I'm going to give it to Rosemary for a lovely spring salad.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
Well, Dr. Tall, you've convinced me. So I was going to have my landscaping guy come and rototill my raised bed, and now you've convinced me that is not the right move. So thank you for that. Okay, this is probably it. So you may not see my face, but you're going to see what I'm doing. So Dr. Tall was talking about these spring plants. So just to get started, it's a very quick recipe. I've got my frozen peas and my fresh sugar snap peas sitting here. I am going to cook them for 2 minutes. So I'm just going to throw those in the, now what I would tell people, I've made this before, what I would tell people is you can get fresh peas at Trader Joe's, but this was just a frozen pea. I would go for maybe not the $1 bag frozen peas, but maybe the $2.99 bag frozen peas, because they really kind of have to stand on their own. Because you're going to be, it's not like you're cooking them and putting butter on them and stuff like that. So I think a high quality pea is really good. The 2 minutes boiling very quick, and then we'll chill them very quickly in the ice water. I have a mix here, so you can see I have a mix here of spring greens with a little bit of arugula. And just to give you a sense, so the arugula was kind of long and stringy, so I chopped that up. One of the things my husband and I had this a week ago, and we're kind of, we're trying to eat it, and we're finding that it was almost like eating spaghetti. The arugula was so long. So I chopped that up so that it's a nice forkful. I have cucumbers here that have been chopped. So this is a nice crunch. We'll throw those in there. I always think there needs to be a little color. So I have sliced radishes right here for that, little bit of color. Now, there were a variety of different recipes. Some called for avocado. So it was almost, some of them were almost an all green salad. And I like a little bit of variety, but I think the avocado will be nice in terms of a smooth creaminess. And then it also called for feta cheese. And again, a nice color combination there. So again, it's mixed spring greens, arugula, cucumbers, an English cucumber for the crunch, radishes for a little bitterness and a little color. Feta cheese gives it a little saltiness, a little spiciness. And then, as you can see, I've got the boiling peas and sugar snap peas. And what's wonderful is they just turn this beautiful color once you cook them. Now you could just thaw the peas because they're frozen, but I also found that they also pop up really nicely. And I would imagine you might be able to find some of this at farmers markets shortly. So then I chill it really quickly in really cold water. And then I add that to the top, peas and sugar snap peas. So now the dressing is a homemade dressing. It's a olive oil, lemon juice, fresh lemon juice, mustard, salt and pepper, and it's got tarragon in it. And I did purchase tarragon and chopped it up and put it in there. And it does take a little time for that flavor to develop. Now, as I've told many of you that you've known me before, I've taught a number of classes for low-income folks. I've taught Cooking Matters, and that tarragon was $2.99. I'm not sure I'd spend $2.99 all the time. It's a nice flavor, but I say this, it's been in my refrigerator for a week and it still looks great. So I think it's nice to have, but it's not a guarantee. It has a very mild flavor, something different because I don't use tarragon very often. But again, if I was trying to encourage someone to try this recipe, you know, that $3 costs more than many other things in the bowl here. And I don't have much use for tarragon other than that. The dressing you have to watch. I made the dressing the first time with the lemon, the juice of a full lemon. It was so tart. It was, you know, you could almost, it was like sucking on a lemon tart. And it calls for also some honey. And I had to double the honey to kind of counteract the tartness. So I learned to do 2 tablespoons of lemon juice in that recipe. So we will dribble here. What I can tell you also that's great about this recipe is that it holds up. Now, I don't usually dress my salad, the whole salad, I dress by serving. And we made this last week and it was delicious the next day. So you're gonna put a lot of time in making a salad. I like it to last a little longer than one evening. Now, certainly for an Easter dinner or some kind of family gathering, sure, you get it all eaten up. But for my husband and I, we enjoyed it one night and then enjoyed it again the next night, and it tasted great. So I like things that kind of have, that hold up over time. So this is your spring pea salad. Again, other recipes, some of them had cooked asparagus as well. That would just be one more spring vegetable to add if that's something, your family liked. So that's it. That's your spring pea salad with tarragon, olive oil, and lemon dressing.
Thank you so much, Rosemary.
Sure.
That looks very, very good. And obviously very easily attainable. Tarragon is an extremely easy herb to grow. I've grown it for years. You can pickle it, you can dry it. It's wonderful in soups. French like using tarragon a lot.
Yes, I did see that a lot. So thank you. So I might try to dry some of this that I still have to see if I can get it to, because I don't have it in my cupboard. I have a lot of spices, but I don't have tarragon. So thank you. That's a great idea. Maybe I'll give it a try this year.
Yeah, and it would work good in a container garden. It's a really lovely herb to grow. So I really want to thank everyone. Next month we are going to have Dr. Reddy with I'm getting this right, Laura, Indian cooking.
No, it's Brad.
It's Dr. Balchek.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you want to say anything, Dr. Balchek, about next week or next month? He's not.
Hey, it took me a minute to unmute there. Not sure what I can say yet because I haven't prepared everything yet, but I know that we're also gonna have some bread that we're gonna cook, so that should be fun.
Totally looking forward to it, and that'll be a good carb. We haven't had carbs for a while. So I do appreciate everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the evening. Dr. Tall's slides will be available on the Culinary Medicine website. So all his references will be there. And if there are no further questions, I wish everyone a happy spring and we will see you next month. Thank you.